everybody, and welcome to my 9th video on the Nikon D40. This video is going to look at the custom menu settings. So we're going to go into menu and then to custom settings. So reset. This gives you two options, yes and no. Yes resets all of the custom settings to the factory defaults, and no backs out of the menu without changes. So if you need to do a reset, you can through here, but it's not something you want to do on a regular basis because any custom settings you've done will be lost. Beep. Off means the camera does not beep, and on means that the camera does beep when it focuses on a subject in single servo AFS mode, or when it focuses on a stationary subject in AFA mode. I always recommend leaving the beep at off, because if you want to take a picture of something like a dog or a kid or a bird or some other animal, the beep will catch their attention and change their behavior and ruin your image. If you're out at a sporting event, sitting next to a bunch of the other parents at your kid's soccer game or whatever, the parents will hate you for having the beep on every time your camera focuses. That's how people get beat up in the bleachers. Okay, for focus mode, I only have a manual focus lens on here, and I don't have any lenses in my kit that autofocus with this camera, so you'll have to trust me a little bit on this. There are four autofocus modes. There's manual focus, which is where the user does all of the focusing by hand, and this is good if you want pin sharp focus. Autofocus will get you into the stadium. Manual focus will get you into the box seats, if you think of it that way. Manual focus can help you get much better pinpoint accuracy in your images. The three autofocus modes are AFS for single servo autofocus, and this is where autofocus kicks on when the shutter is half depressed, and it will autofocus once per shutter push. So if you halfway depress it and focus it, release the button, and then halfway depress again, it will refocus. It focuses on a single object. It is good for photographing stationary objects. If you half depress it, it focuses and your subject moves, it will not refocus until you release the shutter and then refocus again. AFC is continuous servo autofocus. Autofocus kicks on when the shutter is half depressed, and as long as you hold the shutter halfway, the autofocus motor will continuously track moving objects. This is really good for photographing moving objects such as sports, pets, and kids. AFA is auto servo autofocus, and this is where the autofocus kicks on when the shutter is half depressed, and then the camera selects the optimal AF mode based on what's going on in front of it, and this is a pretty good autofocus default setting. The next is autofocus area mode. Again, since I don't have an autofocus lens, I can't really demonstrate this, but there are three modes in this: closest subject, dynamic area, and single area. Closest subject automatically focuses on the closest thing to the camera, and this is good if you have photos with only a single subject, and this is good if you have a subject in front of you and a distant background. Dynamic area allows the user to select one of multiple preset autofocus modes. These include multiple point autofocus, single point autofocus, and select single point autofocus. And these are good for controlling autofocus in select settings such as sports, when the subject will always enter from one side or area. So if you're at a NASCAR race or an F1 race or whatever, and you know that the subject is always going to be approaching you from your left, the dynamic area is a good setting for that. But it can also allow you to select only one or two multiple AF points to use, or just a single point. Single area allows you to select a single autofocus point, and it is good for settings with good light and control and a static subject. Shooting mode has a few different options. The first is single frame, and in single frame, each time you push the shutter button, you will take one image. This is good for most types of shooting, and typically this is the ideal mode. Continuous fires at 2.5 frames per second. This is good for sports and tracking moving subjects. 2.5 frames per second is fairly slow, so you can take a single shot if you have a quick finger. All you have to do is hold the shutter release down for less than 1/3 of a second. And so continuous, if you're quick, can also work as single frame mode. And in a lot, for me, for instance, I almost always leave it in continuous, and then if I just want to take a single frame, just touch the shutter quickly. Self timer, right here, sets a 10-second countdown once the shutter is pressed. This is good for self-portraits and good also for long exposure and tripod shots because it lets the camera shake, the camera shake from the shutter release being pressed. It lets that leave the camera, so it'll give you a more stable shot if you're on a tripod taking a macro photo or star trails. Delayed remote. Using the remote, the shutter fires 2 seconds after you press the button. The self-timer illuminates before the release. This is good for selfies. It's good to prevent camera shake, and it's also, this is another mode, and actually this is the ideal mode for long exposure and reprographic photography. Reprographic basically being if you want to digitize your negatives from your film days or your prints, and you put this on a tripod or a copy stand, and you use the remote control to activate the shutter, because that will help prevent image shake. The next one is quick response remote, and this is using the remote again. The shutter releases when the remote is pushed. The self-timer light flashes after the shutter is released. And this is good for preventing shake and taking images without touching the camera. This is also good for hazardous situations, such as if you were able to, if you wanted to take photos of freight trains, which is a very popular thing for people to take photos of, you could set the camera off next to the bridge, tie it off to a bridge or something like that, wait for the train to come, and you could be a good 25 feet away from the train and just hit the shutter as whenever you want it to as the train's approaching to get the image. And that way you're out of harm's way. There's no risk of accidentally stepping too close to the train or something like that and getting hit. So that's another good option for quick response remote. I'm going to set it to continuous. The next one is metering mode. Note that this option only works if you're in program, aperture exposure, shutter priority, or manual mode. This does not work in a vario program mode. If you're in P for program mode, then this will allow you to, the camera determines the best shutter and aperture speed. In aperture priority, the camera determines the best shutter speed based on aperture, and shutter priority, it determines the best aperture based on shutter, and in manual mode, you can determine whatever you'd like. And so if you have questions about those modes, check out the video on the different mode settings. But for metering, it's not available with my lens, of course. The modes are matrix, center weighted, and spot. So matrix evaluates the entire scene. So if you were seeing this through the viewfinder, the matrix meter would look at everything coming in through the viewfinder. It evaluates the scene based on color. And when a D or a G series lens is mounted, it evaluates the scene with 3D scene data from the lens. It also evaluates the scene based on bright and dark spots, and the averaging meter in this, the matrix meter in this, is more advanced than averaging meters. And I will tell you, the meter on this is very impressive. And if you saw the photos at the end of the first video, they are very well metered. Center weighting meters the images based on a central 8mm, or a little bit less than 7% of the frame size, area. It is probably 60-40 center weighted metering, but it might be 75-25. I wasn't able to find anything that says for certain what the split is, but to my eyes, it seems to meter like a 60-40. The next mode is spot. Spot meters entirely in the center spot of the image, whereas center weighted is about like a circle about like this, Spot is just the very center. And it is the central 3.5 millimeters, which for all intents and purposes, if looking through the viewfinder, it is about the same size as the central autofocus point. And what it means is that 100% of the meter reading is from that 2.5% of the image. And that's really good if you're taking a portrait and you know that the person's face is always going to be in the exact middle of the image. It allows you to meter off of the person's face reliably. No memory card, okay, or lock. So what this does is with release lock, this prevents images from being taken when your camera has no SD card. And this is a good measure to make sure that you remember to bring your SD card, having multiple times forgotten my SD card. In fact, one time having gotten out and taking a whole bunch of pictures of people only to go back inside and find that there was no memory card, boy, did I have egg on my face. At any rate, this is a good measure to make sure that you have an SD card. Enable release allows shutter releasing when there's no SD card. It will display the image on the screen, but it can't save it. And so this is very good for shooting 517 images in one afternoon, getting onto BART after your day to review them all, and screaming loudly when you realize you've shot the images the entire day and had no SD card in your camera. Not that I've been there. Image review, off or on. With on, after taking an image, it displays on your screen. This is good for reminiscing immediately. Bad if you're taking photos at night. Very bad for battery life. Off, the images do not display after taking an image. This is bad for reminiscing immediately. Good for prolonging battery life and shooting at night or inside. And yeah. The next mode is flash compensation. And flash compensation works only in program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and full manual modes. And it allows you to compensate from -3 to +1. And what that means is that that's the amount of additional or reduced light coming out of the flash. So if it's at -3, then the flash is 3 stops dimmer than it would be at 0. And if it's +1, that is 1 stop brighter than it would be at 0. And so basically, it's a good way to reduce flash glare without increasing image depth of field by compensating down. And it's good to allow more depth of field for the same shutter speed by compensating up. And it works in 3rd stop increments. It's actually very, very good for fine flash detail. And that's if you use flash, that is a very powerful flash control tool. The next is the AF Assist light, and you can turn it on or off. The AF Assist light works in all modes except landscape and sports in the Vario Programs section. When it's on, if a subject is poorly lit, a small light will illuminate next to your finger, helping to illuminate the subject for suitable AF tracking. This is good for distracting subjects and ruining other photographers' shots. And this is really good at making you look like an a-hole. When it's off, it turns off the autofocus light. This is bad if you use autofocus at night, but it's good for being courteous to other photographers, and good on you for leaving this off. ISO Auto. So this is automatic ISO selection. I suggest leaving it to off and manually setting your ISO, because otherwise you can get unpredictable image results. If you set it to on, your camera will select your ISO automatically. Maximum sensitivity allows you to determine what the maximum ISO sensitivity will be. And minimum shutter speed allows you to determine what the minimum shutter speed will be. So with these settings, it won't take an image at a sensitivity beyond 400, and it won't take an image with a shutter speed slower than 1/30th of a second. I'm leaving it off because I want to be able to have the ability to control shutter speed and things like that. This is one of those menu functions that basically just removes control from people, but it is designed, I understand, to help people who aren't familiar with some of these settings obtain the best images possible by not accidentally hand-holding an image that's set to take a 1/4 of a second exposure. Automatic settings only work in the program, aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode. The timer and function button. This allows the user to select the function to be performed by the function button. So you can choose one of these. The self timer, which is that the button, if you push and the button's up here on the front of the camera, it's the one that looks like the self timer icon. If you choose this, the button on the front of the camera uses a self timer symbol. So it makes sense to leave it at self timer. That's how I have it set. Otherwise, there's no readily available way to access the self timer. You can also change shooting mode. You could use the function button to switch between single frame, continuous, time, self timer, and etc. That's also another very good use of it, because if you change shooting modes rapidly or frequently, that can be great. If you don't, then you can accidentally switch into self timer or remote control when you think you're in continuous mode, and that can be frustrating. You can also have it set to change your image quality or size, which means you can rotate between the number of megapixels, and this can be useful if you switch between different image sizes, but who does that and why? The next one is ISO sensitivity. So you can change between your different ISO sensitivities, and the sensitivity displays in the viewfinder, so that accidental switches between sensitivities should be avoidable. And usually the sensitivity doesn't have to be changed. So this strikes me as an odd option, because if you're out on a hike or something like that, you're not going to be changing different sensitivities unless you're hiking into tunnels and caves and things like that. White balance allows you to use that function to change the camera's white balance. This is another one of these things that I guess it's useful if you shoot a mix of indoor and outdoor images in one shoot. So if you're going to shoot your best friend's wedding or something like that, and they're going to be taking some outdoor photos, and then you're going to go inside under some tungsten lighting and shoot some portraits for their wedding album, and then you're going to go into the dance floor under fluorescent lighting, and then you're going to go back outside and all kinds of crazy stuff. I guess that kind of makes sense, but that seems like a rare case. Now you can also, because it's a menu item, change the function anytime you need to. My own preference is always to keep the buttons as static as possible, so I know what's going to happen when I push a certain button. The next is auto exposure lock, autofocus lock. This option changes the way that the AEL and AFL button functions. So AEAF lock right here locks, when you push the AEAFL button, it locks both the focus and the exposure. So this is good if you're taking multiple action shots with one focus point and one setting. Good for animated GIFs, time-lapse imagery, things like that especially. And the next one is AE lock. This is the way I have it set up. This is a really good setting. It locks only the exposure settings, but focus can still be changed with autofocus. With manual focus, the AF lock doesn't do anything. This is good for taking multiple action shots, let's say on a sports field, and having them all have the approximate same look. You can turn this off by changing camera settings, or if you do the automatic exposure lock by pushing the button, it will stay on until you change camera settings or push the AE lock button again. Autofocus lock locks the autofocus. The exposures will change as needed. So if you have a sports field that's half covered in shade, then the exposures will be different in the shade, the shutter speed or the aperture, than they are in the sun. This is good for situations with changing lighting, clouds moving in rapidly, things like that. And if you have a stationary subject. And this is also good for things like if you're at a concert or a fireworks display. And again, you can turn this off. If you push the AF button, you can turn it off by changing the camera settings or pushing the button again. AE lock hold. This holds the exposure settings from when the button is pushed until when it is pushed again or the camera is turned off. And this is good if you want to change the shutter speed and have the aperture adjust automatically. So basically think of it this way. This is an EV lock, not an AE lock. I think the terminology here is off. Exposure value means 1/125th at f5.6 is the same as 1/60th at f8 or 1/250th at f4.5. And those all transmit the same amount of light to the film, with slightly different results outside the scope of this video. So what this would do is, let's say you're at 1/25th f5.6 and you push this button. Now you change your shutter to 1/250th, the camera will automatically change to f4.5. If you change to f4.5, the camera will automatically change to 1/250th. And so what happens is it keeps the amount of light the same and compensates for the different settings that you have. So this is another good way to change the shutter or aperture value and have all of your images have approximately the same look. That way you can take you're at your kid's baseball game, let's say, and they're out pitching. You can take a picture where you're focused just on them and the grass looks green and the dirt looks brown and the other players in the background are just, you know, team color blobs. Or you can increase the depth of field and you can get them where your kid is still sharp and so are the grandstands and the other players, and the grass is still green and the dirt is still brown and the colors are still the same, and you don't have to recalculate everything. So that's where that function is very useful. So AF on. That means that the AE lock, AF lock button will initiate autofocus. And so earlier I described the autofocus as when you have to press the shutter button, the camera will autofocus. With this, you can also push that button to have the camera autofocus. And that's good if you're not looking through the viewfinder. In cameras with live view, which this does not have, that's extremely useful. Here we go. Sorry, next one. AE lock, off or on. Off is the default. When off, the image exposure is not calculated until the shutter activates. This gives the best meter reading at the moment that the photo is taken. So, in general, I recommend leaving this off because it will give you a more accurate exposure if lighting suddenly changes. For instance, if you're out taking photos at night and a partly dead street light suddenly kicks on or something like that. If it's on, this locks the exposure when the shutter is half depressed. So this is good if you want to preset your exposure and know that the subject will change the settings. So for instance, if you're taking a picture of a snowy field and you've got a black bear that's going to run through it and fill up most of the frame, the camera is going to meter snow differently than the black bear, obviously. And so if you turn this on, then you can lock that setting when you have to press the shutter. Wait a couple seconds, the bear runs through, you take your picture, and the snow still looks white, and the bear then looks really black instead of the bear looking gray, and all of the snow being so white that the image is unusable. The next is built-in flash. And there are two modes for this, TTL and manual. TTL stands for through the lens, and this sets the flash setting automatically based on the through the lens meter reading. This works only if you have a camera that gives you a lens that gives your camera meter data. This is good for most situations to achieve even scene lighting. I prefer manual. And you can set it to 1/32 power to full power, anywhere in that range. I like having control over it. TTL gives you just automatic controls for it. Also, because I don't use lenses that give this camera metering data, I have to have the flash in manual mode if I want to use it. Also, the flash in manual mode allows creative control over the flash power. It allows you to achieve creative lighting effects. And it's worth noting that, as far as I know, that control level is not just for the onboard flash. It also extends to flashes on your hot shoe or being controlled through release cables or otherwise remotely. Auto off timers. This is an important menu item. And there are 4 options: short, normal, and long. Normal being the default. This allows you to control how long the exposure meter, image review, and playback will occur. Short sets menus to remain on for 4 seconds. Image review, if it's on, will be 4 seconds, and the exposure meter, which is when you have to press the shutter and it's about to take the image, the exposure will the meter will remain on for 4 seconds. After 5 seconds, it will take another meter reading if you release the shutter button. For normal, which is the default, menus remain on for 4 seconds, image reviews also for 4 seconds. The exposure meter stays on for 8 seconds. For long, menus remain on for 20 seconds, image review, if on, remains for 20 seconds, and the exposure meter will stay on for 60 seconds. Custom, which is what I like, allows you to change menus to 4, 8, 20, and 60 seconds or 10 minutes. If your image review is on, that is for 4, 8, 20, or 60 seconds or 10 minutes. And your exposure meter can stay on for 4, 8, 20, or 60 seconds or 30 minutes. So for me, my playback menus I like to have on for 10 minutes because, especially filming this video right now, could you imagine what would happen if every 4 seconds this menu were to turn off? It would be awful. Image review, I have it set at 4 seconds because that's the slowest. I actually keep my image review off, so it's 0 seconds in practice. My auto metering I set at 20 seconds. For cameras I've used that have auto metering, they usually turn off about 16 seconds. So this was just the nearest setting that I was accustomed to. And done lets you set it. Self-timer. This allows the user to choose the self-timer duration. So I have it set for 10 seconds, but you can choose 2, 5, 10, or 20 seconds. 2 and 5 seconds are good if you're doing reprographic work, for instance. So if you're going to set your camera up to take pictures of slides and negatives for the next 8 hours, yeah, my weekends aren't super exciting, what can I say? Then this is a good setting. You can hit the self-timer after 2 seconds. When the camera shake has worked its way out of the camera, it will take a nice sharp image of whatever you're taking a copy of. 10 seconds is good for a typical selfie, or when you want to, so that you can set the self-timer and then run up in front of the camera to a group of friends. 20 seconds is good for a typical selfie if you need to run a long ways. Remote on duration. This is how long the camera will wait for a remote control signal. The longer times shorten battery life if you're using the remote control often. So I have it set for 15 minutes so that I have plenty of time to mess around with settings and framing and things like that before taking an image. And that represents everything in the custom settings menu. Hi everybody, and welcome to my 9th video. Oh no, oh, dang it. And this is how you change the battery.